Let's talk about a new crime, ecocide.
Could this be punished like war crimes? The planet is dying.
We need to start treating this crisis like a crisis.
We are on the verge of the abyss.
Could a change to international law be part of the answer? There's now a push for a new crime, ecocide.
On September 9th, 2024, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa proposed a bold amendment to the Rome Statute, urging the world to recognize a new international crime, ecocide. But what is ecocide? How do we define it? And could this change the future of environmental accountability?
In this episode, we will delve into these questions and much more with our guest, Lilian Robb. Lilian is a legal practitioner, Stop Ecocide Switzerland representative, and a PhD candidate in international law at the Geneva Graduate Institute.
Hello everyone, my name is Purva.
And my name is Ola.
And today we're going to take you through our conversation with Lilian Robb.
We hope you will come along with us and learn more about ecocide and why it is such an important issue to discuss, especially in the current socio-political climate.
Hi Lilian, welcome to our podcast and thank you for being here. The Stop Ecocide Foundation defines ecocide as unlawful or wanton acts committed with the knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. Could you explain what ecocide means in the context of international law?
The answer to your question is because it's not law yet, it's unclear what it means. So this definition that you've cited is the one created by Philip Sands and the group of legal experts that sat down and drafted a law. It's important to remember that they are legal experts proposing a potential law, which means that it hasn't been agreed on by states, so it's not law, but also their report, right, that they put accompanying this definition is quite short. It's quite brief. It doesn't go into the level of detail that would be gone into in negotiations of an actual kind of amendment to the Rome Statute, for example. So it isn't super clear. It was drafted as a starting point and it's been discussed as a starting point. So there's a lot of like blog posts and stuff out there of different legal scholars weighing in. And a lot of people, for example, don't like this use of the word wanton. They think it's unclear. And there's a lot of discussion around that definition. So the short answer is, at the moment, in international law, it doesn't mean anything.
You know, Purva, it's interesting that ecocide, or at least the destruction of the environment, is an issue that has existed for so long, but there's still a lack of global consensus surrounding the definition.
Absolutely. I imagine that the discussion around what should count as ecocide has been incredibly politicized. I think it's important to mention that Lilian also brought up how the first time the word ecocide was used was in the context of the Vietnam War to refer to the environmental devastation caused by the U.S. military's use of Agent Orange.
Yes, I thought it was interesting that she discussed how that specific form of destruction of the environment as a military target is already covered by other branches of law, so the initial use of the term ecocide was not legally necessary in that context. When we're thinking about it academically, though, I wonder if states' hesitation to agree to a legal definition for ecocide is in part in order to avoid blame and potential legal consequences.
I'm sure that's a contributing factor. I'm also sure it's difficult to produce examples of what the term ecocide could cover when it comes to criminalizing certain acts, because we can talk about things like large-scale pollution, clearing of forests, burning the Amazon, as Lilian mentioned, but we risk closing off the definition to other potential cases that could occur in the future.
Right, and then we have to think about the issue of active versus negligent damage. Can states be held accountable for failing to prevent damage along with actively causing it? These are all questions we need to consider when we talk about producing an international legal definition of ecocide.
So we've talked a bit about international law in general, but how, in your opinion or in your legal expertise, does ecocide relate to human rights law?
I'll start with like my general academic position, which is that in international law, we have created a false binary between the environment and human rights because we come from a Western way of thinking in which those two things are considered very separately. I think that that needs to shift, because for a lot of cultures, those two things are not separate in the way that they are for us. And I think that international law is starting to move towards that, starting to understand that, especially with the rise of Indigenous rights and the acknowledgement that, for example, for Indigenous people, these two things are not separate. Then there's also in international law the recognition of explicit rights, that environmental damage and the human rights of populations are connected. So, for example, you have the right to a healthy environment, recently recognised, which then connects environmental damage directly to a human right. But then you also have all of these cases where either environmental damage has flow-on human impacts or human rights damage has flow-on environmental impacts. And there's a lot of recognition in both spheres of those connections. So for me, as a theoretical academic position, they can't be separated, and we've created a false binary. And in legal normative sense, I think these two things are coming closer together. And it's reached the point now, I would argue, that you can't talk about human rights law without considering the right to a healthy environment. And you also can't talk about environmental law without connecting it to human damages.
I find this idea of the ideological binary between human rights and environmental protection super interesting. I think we can see how Western-centric perspectives often prioritize environmental conservation only when it benefits human activities, which overlooks the inherent value of nature itself.
You know, I was actually thinking about this because I was interested in the use of the word wanton in the definition of ecocide. Wanton activity means damage excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated, meaning a lot of environmental damage could be excused because it benefits humans. And when we're talking about benefits for humans, we're referring to benefits for wealthy and privileged groups and states, while only vulnerable groups such as Indigenous peoples suffer and bear the brunt of the harmful consequences of environmental destruction.
That is a really interesting point. We can really see here how Western perspectives on the environment and its protection exclude and disempower Indigenous peoples' deep cultural connections with their land.
It's important for us to understand that protecting the environment requires not only legislative changes, but also social and cultural shifts towards recognizing that the distinction between humans and nature is artificial and harmful towards any effective protection efforts. As you touched on the issue of Indigenous rights and connection to land, we were wondering if you have any thoughts about the legacy of settler colonialism and its relationship with environmental destruction and environmental loss. The mainstream understanding of genocides restricts genocide to acts committed against the bodies of individual people, and some genocide researchers argue that this human rights framework does a disservice to colonized Indigenous people who experience, as some researchers call it, a social death by the loss of relationship to their land. You mentioned that you're currently in Australia, and I know that conversations about Indigenous rights are prevalent there. How do you see this relationship between settler colonialism and environmental loss playing out in that context?
I'd start off by saying that I'm not Indigenous. So what I say next is my experience from what I've heard from Indigenous people and trying to communicate that as a non-Indigenous person. In Australia, we did have a genocide, and it was a genocide in both the traditional sense and in the sense that you're talking about, of loss of connection to land. And I think that there's a really strong misunderstanding in Western cultures, for lack of a better word, of what that means, and of how violent a disconnection from country is. So in Australia, land, when you're speaking about it in this sense, in the culturally important sense for Indigenous people, you call it country. So disconnection from country is, for Indigenous Australians, a lost identity, a loss of knowledge system, a loss of culture, a loss of belonging, it's also a cost to the environment because they lose their stewards. The environment loses a very crucial part of how the environment maintains itself. So in Australia, there's a lot of understanding of this that has been very generously communicated by Indigenous Australians, and it's been a really big movement. Here, settler colonialism involved that kind of damage, and the genocide that was committed here involved that kind of damage. And I'm not sure that the international definitions yet have sufficiently incorporated that. We have to acknowledge that they're all written from a very particular lens by a very particular group of people without the participation of populations that were affected. And so they're always going to be a bit one-sided.
Lillian's discussion about disconnection from the environment being a cultural loss for Indigenous communities has really hit a point for me. From Western perspectives, we often think of land as something separate from people, but for Indigenous peoples, land is central to their identity, and losing that connection to land is devastating.
I agree. I think it's also important to recognize that while environmental destruction is a consequence of colonialism, it is also often a weapon deliberately used against Indigenous populations. Beyond taking away the physical land for purposes of settling there, colonialism takes away the culture and identity of Indigenous people. It's a form of violence that's hard to grasp without truly understanding how integral land is to Indigenous ways of life.
Yes, we've seen throughout history how colonial projects have weaponized the destruction of the environment to destroy the self-resilience of Indigenous groups. And we see today how dispossession of land has prevented Indigenous peoples from healing from the genocides they suffered. On top of everything, the frameworks that we use to talk about these issues, whether it's genocide or ecocide, are often written from a Western perspective without the input of the people they affect the most. This makes it harder to fully capture the extent of the harm done and heal from it.
Exactly. If we're serious about reconciliation and justice, we need to broaden our definitions and acknowledge these deeper connections between land, culture, and identity. It's not just about fixing the damage, it's about truly understanding and respecting what was lost.
Looking forward, what changes would you hope to see in the international community's approach to environmental protection and ecocide?
I think that currently a lot of environmental law results from human impact. We have very few laws that are purely ecocentric. So we have very few laws that criminalize, that dissuade, that problematize destruction of the environment as a valuable thing per se, regardless of its connection to a human harm. And I think that really needs to shift, because I think that's a very instrumental understanding of the environment. I think it's a very Western disconnected understanding of what the environment is for. It assumes that the environment is there to serve human needs, and also that the law is there to serve human needs. And so we only protect the environment in that frame. And for me, that's not good enough. I think we have to be able to protect the environment for the environment's sake, and absent any ability to prove that it will harm any people. And I think that involves a change in our thinking, in our understanding of how important the environment is and how to think about the environment. But I also think that it involves incorporating more the understandings of cultures that do not think of the environment in the same way as us. Like, we have to acknowledge that the international system that exists today includes so many more perspectives than it did when we wrote these laws, than when we established this system. And for many of those ways of thinking, this does not at all work. So I think that we need to adapt. And I think envirocentric laws are part of that.
Wow, that was an incredibly enlightening discussion. I think this conversation really challenges us to rethink our relationship with the environment and the laws that protect it. Ecocide is more than just a concept proposing better environmental protection. It's a call for justice that intersects environment, human rights, and Indigenous rights. The part that really stood out to me, especially in the current political climate, is the need for a paradigm shift towards how we value and protect the environment.
Absolutely. Recognizing ecocide is an important step in the reparation process for those impacted by occupation and colonialism. Environmental destruction, such as the pollution of water and land, often has long-term impacts that persist well beyond the duration of conflicts, yet these harms have rarely been acknowledged in legal frameworks. When coupled with settler colonialism, where the environment holds deep cultural significance, the loss extends beyond physical damage to cultural death, a profound severance from identity, heritage, and knowledge systems. Acknowledging these dimensions is essential and should be incorporated into reparation processes to ensure holistic and culturally sensitive justice.
Yes, and in the end, we can see how embedding ecocide into international law is more than a legal challenge. It's also a moral and philosophical journey towards redefining our relationship with the environment and justice. The concept of ecocide challenges us to expand our legal and moral frameworks, to recognize the value of the environment and its deep connections to cultural identity and human rights. For Indigenous and occupied peoples, environmental harm is not only ecological, but also cultural.
As we move forward, the recognition of ecocide offers a path towards more inclusive justice systems, acknowledging the voices of those most impacted and addressing the long-term repercussions of environmental destruction. This is particularly important in today's world, where climate change poses disproportionate risks for the world's most vulnerable population.
Thank you all for listening to this episode, and we hope this conversation inspires you to think more critically about environmental destruction and its relationship to colonial violence and the rights of people everywhere.